Hey guys, welcome to Critical Issues in Arts and Culture. Today's lecture is going to be on Afrofuturism. So if you are watching this video, that means that you are indeed enrolled in Critical Issues in Arts and Culture. So yay. Okay, so let's just jump right in. Afrofuturism is a really large topic to discuss in 15-20 minutes, so we're not going to cover everything about it in the allotted time for this lecture, but I will be able to give you an overview of what it is. So at the end of this lecture, you will be able to define what Afrofuturism is, and particularly as it relates to arts and culture, how it helps to facilitate a conversation about the kinds of issues that come up in arts and culture. See what I did there? So let's just get right into it, okay? So what is Afrofuturism? The name itself almost seems pretty self-explanatory, right? But there's a little bit more involved in that. So a kind of simplistic definition of Afrofuturism is any story or piece of work that deals with African Americans or Africans dealing with technology or futuristic elements in entertainment, right? So in film, in literature, in music, right? Any kind of art form. Like I said, that's a very simplistic definition or example of it. But Afrofuturism was actually coined in 1994 by cultural critic Mark Derry. And his definition, it's a little bit heady, but I'm going to give it to you, but don't worry about it. I'm just going to tell you. He calls it fiction that treats African American themes and addresses African American concerns in the context of 20th century technoculture, and more generally, African American signification that appropriates images of technology and a prosthetically enhanced future. Right. Right. I told you it was pretty, it was a lot. Essentially what he was talking about was pretty much what I said at the beginning, right? Like a simplistic version of that, which is there's stories that position African American culture, African American experiences at the fore, and usually take place in some sort of futuristic setting. So Mark Derry, like I said, is a cultural critic. I believe he's still alive. And essentially what he was doing was he was noticing this trend, right, of African Americans telling stories that involved a lot of technology and futuristic elements. And he was trying to, as a critic of culture, was trying to put a name to what it was that he was seeing, right? So this is somebody from the outside observing a situation, a trend, an uptick in the culture, a shift in the cultural dynamic as it pertains to the African American community, and he's trying to identify it and label it and explain what it is and what's happening. And so while that's a good place to start, I actually prefer Ytasha Womack's definition of Afrofuturism because she is actually an Afrofuturist, and there's some I feel like there's more merit coming from a person who self-identifies from within a particular community, actually then naming and describing that community from within. So her definition says that Afrofuturism combines elements of science fiction, historical fiction, fantasy, and Afrocentricity with non-Western beliefs. That it is a total re-envisioning of the past and speculation about the future, and it's rife with cultural critiques. So, let's break that down a little bit. Like, what does that mean? Essentially, she is saying that Afrofuturism must always contain some sort of dialogue about the cultural issues that are affecting the African American community. And I meant to say this at the beginning, but for the confines of this lecture and for this class, we're just going to limit Afrofuturism to the African American community, right? Descendants of Africans who live in America. Now, Afrofuturism is much broader than that, but again, because this is only like a 15-minute lecture, we don't have time to get into all of that, right? But really, Afrofuturism encompasses all the places where descendants of Africans live, right? So obviously the continent of Africa itself and all the countries within there, and also all the places where Africanized people may inhabit, right? So that's the Caribbean, obviously it's America, it's Europe, right? But for our purposes of the discussion, especially since we are talking about an American film, even though that film is set in a fictionalized African country, we're going to sort of limit our discussion of Afrofuturism to America. So she's saying that in order for something to really be called a piece of Afrofuturistic art, it must be commenting on issues that are affecting the African American community, and as it's doing that, it is utilizing science fiction, historical fantasy, or historical fiction and fantasy. And so I like that definition because since Afrofuturism contains the word future in it, most people would assume that Afrofuturism is solely concerned with aspects of the future. But what is part of many African cultures, and also the African American culture here, it retains a relationship with the past, right? So it's saying that the future obviously cannot happen without the past, and you need to stay connected to that. And so a lot of stories that are Afrofuturistic in nature will deal with stories from the past. And so her inclusion of historical fiction is very telling, right? And so you would see in a lot of Afrofuturistic art a lot of African or Africanized images, and by that I mean you would see things like a Sankofa or an Egyptian Ankh, and I'm going to include those images in the learning modules so that you'll know what that is, or since this is a video, if you want to pause it, you can Google those things right now, or you don't even have to pause it, you can just Google it, just to have an idea of what that looks like. But the Sankofa in particular, the image of the bird looking back with an egg in its mouth, sums up the African, there are many different countries in Africa, so I'm just going to gloss over that and say African, but we know that different countries have different cultures and languages. But the Sankofa is an image, an African image that is about the connection to the past and the future. Because as the bird is looking backwards to represent a relationship to the past, the egg, which is its progeny, its children, signifies the future. And so you would see a lot of different African images throughout a lot of Afrofuturistic work. As a matter of fact, one of the early pieces of Afrofuturistic cinema is a film called Sankofa. And it came out also in 1994 and is about a woman who is visiting the slave auction places in West Africa where the slaves were, where Africans were enslaved and shipped out from the coast to various places throughout the world, Europe, America, and enslaved. And she sort of steps through a portal and is transported back into like the antebellum South. And so time travel as a piece of science fiction is also a convention of a lot of Afrofuturistic stories. Again, sort of trying to make that link between the past and the present. So before we start talking about Black Panther, the like remaining moments that we have, and starting to discuss what makes that a piece of Afrofuturistic cinema, it's important to also note that while this is not contained in the definitions of Afrofuturism, a huge aspect of Afrofuturism contains the ideas of challenging notions of, well, accepted notions of blackness. And what I mean by that is that Afrofuturism purposely situates Black bodies or Africanized bodies in places that have been typically where they have been typically shut out of, right? So for instance, if we look at fantasy, if you take a moment to, I would like you all to take a moment to think about the various like fantasy novels or movies or television shows that you've seen, and just count on however many fingers and hands you need to the number of Black characters that exist in that world or those worlds. And I would wager that you can probably use one hand to do so, maybe one and a half. And though the tide is changing a little bit, it has not really evolved to the place where when you think of fantasy and science fiction, you see a lot of Black characters. One of my favorite shows on TV, and I reference this a lot, is Game of Thrones. And now, I'm not as upset about Season 8 as many other people are, and we can totally have a discussion about this if you feel like you need to. I'm not getting into any of that. But as it's one of my favorite shows, I also was noticing how many Black characters existed in that world. And there weren't a lot. And I don't know if the ones that showed up were actually scripted to be Black or if they just were Black because the actors that were cast happened to be Black, right? And that's a distinction, right? That's a bit of a difference. And so Afrofuturism is saying by placing Black bodies in venues where they typically are not seen, like fantasy, so like a Game of Thrones type show or movie, or science fiction, or having them deal with technology, having them deal with science. They're saying that there is a place for these bodies and these stories, that it is not an aberration to see a Black scientist or a Black time traveler or a Black elf, right? I also enjoy The Lord of the Rings and didn't see uh, any black characters in that wonderful franchise, right? So by doing that, by having these characters deal with technology and science and math and all of these things that uh, have pretty much historically been hostile places for African Americans to exist, it's challenging the wider society's notions of what is possible for black bodies to do, to experience. And that is a huge goal of Afrofuturism. And so while it's enjoying a resurgence today because of the overwhelming success of Black Panther, Afrofuturism is actually almost 100 years old. In 1926, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote a short story called The Comet. And you can look that up. It's a very interesting story. It's set in the 80s. So for 1926, that was the future. But for us today, it's clearly the past, and it's kind of funny. But again, it's making a commentary on the social issue of the day, which was segregation. And it was set in New York City. And so a lot of people like to think that because New York City is touted as this, bastion of liberalism, that there's no segregation there, that there's no racism there. And that's not true. As a person from New Jersey, I can tell you there's a lot of those things that exist and have existed historically in that city, as it has in this country. And so that story is investigating what it's like for, a black man to move through that world in these systems of segregation and racism and separatism. And so it's a very interesting story. So if you're interested, I would say check it out. But so as we start to wind down on this lecture, about Afrofuturism, I want you to hold fast to this, that Afrofuturism centers around putting black bodies in non-traditional spaces, meaning spaces where they have not typically been embraced, right? Which is why it uses technology, science, in particular math, and uses fantasy and science fiction and time traveling as ways to comment on ideas about blackness and black bodies and what they can and cannot do, what they should and shouldn't do. And so for just the last few moments, let's just talk about Afrofuturism's relationship to Black Panther. And this is going to show up in a discussion board or a writing assignment, probably, just a discussion board comment, to get you to further think about how Black Panther itself is Afrofuturistic and what sort of issues the film is raising. But I want you to also think about, just in general, just the images that you encounter around African Americans in entertainment. So, for instance, if the only information you received about African Americans came from the media, came from entertainment, what would your takeaway be about that community, right? So I want you to be thinking about that as you deal with questions in the discussion board, which is available now. Excuse me. But in thinking about, now that we've talked about Afrofuturism in the closing 30 seconds or so, I want you to think about Afrofuturism as it exists in the film Black Panther. Okay, does Black Panther comment on, make a cultural critique about issues that are affecting the African American community? if so, how is it doing that? Is it using technology? Is it using science? Like what is it using to make a comment on the issues that you believe are affecting the African American community? What is it saying about the placement of the main characters, right? Who are the main characters? Who are the side characters? How do those storylines sort of intersect? What kind of African or Africanized imagery do you see throughout the film? And what is it saying about the notions of Black identity based on what I've talked about in this lecture? So keep all of that in your mind as you watch Black Panther again, this time with a critical eye, not just for enjoyment. I could watch Black Panther 100,000 times. I enjoy the movie. But look at it critically, thinking about what this lecture is about and what Afrofuturism is, and start to apply that to the question that comes up in the discussion board. So I had a great time with this. Again, it was really short. It's hard to get out everything about Afrofuturism in the 21-minute lecture, but I could talk about it all day. But if you have any other questions about Afrofuturism, or you're curious about some things, or you'd like to just discuss it, please feel free to send me an email, and we can have a conversation about it. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the lecture, and have a good evening.